Hi, everyone. It's Rob, and thanks for listening in today. I greatly appreciate your time. Today, you will hear my chat with Jim McClintock, an endowed university professor of polar and marine biology at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. His research has been funded continuously over the past 25 years by the National Science Foundation, and that's a big deal. He recently returned from his 15th research expedition to Antarctica, where he and his research collaborators have become among the world's authorities on Arctic marine chemical ecology and drug discovery. His expertise on the ecological impacts of climate change and ocean acidification on marine life of the Arctic Peninsula has garnered numerous invited lectures and published pieces. His book, Lost Antarctica: Adventures in a Disappearing Land, with an endorsement from Bill Gates, was released in September 2012 and has garnered considerable national and international praise. In June 2013, a video short based on his book was produced and released by the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation that featured narration by Harrison Ford. I've read it, and I will tell you there's lots of funny stories, it's educational, and it's really an easy read. You will enjoy it. Jim has published over 290 scientific publications, edited and written books, and been invited to make numerous scientific and popular science presentations. His research has been featured in a variety of media outlets, including the NPR's Diane Rem Show and On Point with Tom Ashbrook, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Discover, Scientific American, CNN, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Chicago Tribune, The Los Angeles Times, and the Weather Channel. He has served on the National Academy of Sciences workshops on climate change and polar ecosystems. In 2016, he spoke on stage at the Lincoln Center in New York City in a performance of The Moth that was featured on NPR. This past year, he was elected as a fellow in the prestigious Explorers Club, and stories of his life and career as polar marine scientist served as the basis of a theatrical production scripted by a nationally renowned playwright. We discuss what it's like to spend time on Antarctica, how his groundbreaking work studies ways to eradicate diseases like cancer and HIV, what Antarctica is teaching us about climate change, and how we can make a difference, and why you will never be the same if you visit Antarctica even just once. So please enjoy my chat with Professor Jim McClintock. I read a quote recently that you referenced from Rachel Carson. She's a world-renowned biologist, writer, and ecologist. And it goes like this: if a child is to keep alive his inborn sense of wonder, he needs the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, rediscovering with him or her the joy, excitement, and mystery of the world we live in. What is it about that quote that makes it a favorite for you?
Oh, it just touches me at the heart, the wonder of learning and how learning continues on through life from the time that you're born until you pass away. It's just a fantastic sense of wonder, the wonderment of nature.
Yeah.
What's so special about Rachel had a great way of capturing that essence.
Yeah, so true. It's a beautiful quote. I wanted to jump into your many years of spending time in Antarctica. For starters, let the audience know how many years you've been going to Antarctica and how many consecutive years as well.
Yeah, so I first visited the Antarctic, the sub-Antarctic actually, in the year 1982. So it's been quite a while. And that was a wonderful opportunity to get my feet wet. I was lucky enough to get invited to go with my professor. I was a graduate student. We went down to an island in the sub-Antarctic called Kerguelen, which is in the southern Indian Ocean. A very long voyage, some 14 days at sea. And that 3 months that I spent living and working on this sub-Antarctic island, an island that was known for its large rookeries of king penguins, macaroni penguins, rock hoppers, elephant seal rookeries. We were surrounded by just abundant marine life. Just titillated the senses, if you will. And I was doing some scuba diving. We were diving on sort of kelp forest, very cold water, but not quite as cold as where I dove later. And it instilled in me a love for the Antarctic, a love for the wonder of doing science in Antarctica, because I guess it's sort of like being a kid in a candy store. Everywhere you looked, there was a new question to be asked. And when you poked around in the literature, you realized that you were the first ones that were asking it. And so that was very exciting. And that set up the next trip to Antarctica, which was as a postdoctoral fellow, working through UC Santa Cruz, and going down to McMurdo Station with my mentor at the time, John Pierce. And so that in turn, after 2 more expeditions to McMurdo Station and diving down there under the ice and studying marine invertebrate ecology, and I was positioned then to apply for positions at academic institutions and really be competitive to write my own grant proposals to return to Antarctica. And with great due to my colleagues, I have 2 colleagues that are collaborators. The 3 of us have worked over the past 25 years now together and been successful at essentially sustaining funding from the National Science Foundation for our Antarctic program. And I just returned this past March from my 15th research expedition to Antarctica. So each one of those expeditions is typically about a 2-month stay for me. Some of the graduate students in our program will stay down at the station for up to 6 months at a time. And so I'd say over the last 35 to 40 years, I've been quite active in Antarctic marine biology.
So Jim, when you're headed there, how exactly do you get there?
Okay, well, this depends on what part of Antarctica I'm going to.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last 20 years, my work has been at Palmer Station. There's 3 American stations in Antarctica. Your audience might be interested in knowing that. There's one at the South Pole that I've never been to because there's very little marine biology at the South Pole. And then there's McMurdo Station, which is a very large station. It constitutes sort of the city of Antarctica, if you will. During the austral summer, there's about 1,000 Americans there working in the summer, and then drops down to a couple hundred in the winter. So during the 10 years in the mid 80s to the mid 90s, when I was working at McMurdo Station, I would fly from Birmingham, Alabama to New Zealand and the South Island and the town called Christchurch on the South Island, which is the jumping off point for getting down to McMurdo Station. You go by air, and it was always an adventure. We'd arrive in Christchurch and spend a couple nights in a bed and breakfast waiting for the phone call. And we'd go down to a special facility to get all of our cold weather clothing checked out to us for the season. And then we'd eventually the phone would ring. We'd end up at the airport, and if we were lucky, we would get in to McMurdo that day. When I say lucky, I mean that what can happen when you're going to McMurdo Station from Christchurch is that the weather can change after you've taken off. And so what they call these turnaround flights, and it would mean that you'd be up in the air for 2 or 3 or 4 hours. And then suddenly the plane would head back to New Zealand, because what had happened at McMurdo is the wind had picked up, and the wind picks up the dry snow that lays on the surface of the ice, almost like sand in the desert, and creates what they call a whiteout. You can't really see definition in it. pilots are very cautious about landing in those circumstances. I had a colleague one year who did 7 turnaround flights where he got in. So it took him, I think, 2 weeks. But I was very fortunate. The 5 or 6 times I went to McMurdo Station, we were able to fly in. It's about a 6 or 7 hour flight on a C-130, and we made it each time safely. And now where I work in Palmer, it's a very different scenario because you cannot fly to Palmer Station on the Antarctic Peninsula. There really is no airport. There's a glacier behind the station that in emergencies, they don't like to land on it, but it is possible to take a Twin Otter, a small plane, and land on it. I did see a Twin Otter land on it once, and the pilot got out white as a sheet and said he'd never do that again. So what we do to get to Palmer Station is we sail. And the ship that we go on is typically one of the 2 U.S. research vessels. It's called the Lawrence Gould. And we meet it in Punta Arenas, Chile. And it's about I would say, excuse me, it's about typically about a 4.5-day trip to sail from Punta Arenas down to the station. We cross the Drake Passage, which is notorious for its rough waters at times. We belovedly call it Lake Drake if it's calm and flat. And then it can also be what's called the Drake Shake, which is a different experience entirely. And I actually came back once from Palmer Station on the Drake Passage, and I talk about this in my book, Lost Antarctica. I woke up midair because I had been tossed from my upper bunk and spent most of the night sort of sliding around on the floor of the cabin. The seas were running somewhere around 30 to 40 feet during the night. So it can be exciting. So it's very different getting to McMurdo Station or getting to Palmer Station, air versus ocean. And they both have their pluses and minuses.
You never know what you're going to get.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to get.
Your book is, I want to talk a little bit about this in a moment, but it's a great read. You've got a great sense of humor, by the way. I want to compliment you on that. I found myself laughing at many moments, including the story you just told in a little bit more detail about flying out of your bunk and all the things on the desk flying all over the place.
Right.
It really gave me a sense for what it might be like in rough waters crossing the Drake Passage. Once you're there, does your body need to adjust to this climate? And like, what are things that a layman like myself might notice if I were there that's happening to my body?
Yeah, again, this depends a little bit on whether you're going to McMurdo or to Palmer. Palmer is much more temperate, a little warmer. So the impacts are not quite as dramatic. At McMurdo Station, you immediately notice the dryness of the air. The air is so dry that your throat tends to dry up a lot. Your lips become chapped if you don't, you're not using chapstick. So you're constantly fighting real intensive dryness. And you have to be conscious also of just going outside at McMurdo. It's cold enough that you've got to have all your cold weather clothing, your big jacket, your gloves, or else things can get interesting real fast. And certainly if you go off station, you're carrying a survival bag and doing all the things to make sure that if the weather changes very quickly, which is one of the things that can happen in Antarctica, it can really catch you by surprise. You go out on a beautiful sunny day and suddenly the wind comes up and the clouds come in, and the next thing you know, you have to be careful. And then at Palmer Station, not so much. Palmer Station's a little more of a less of adjustment. There is a dryness to the air, and your skin has to adjust to it. A very bright environment, so you're always wearing your polar sunglasses and these kinds of things. There is one thing as well that I should mention, and that is that at McMurdo Station, when I would go down during the austral summer, effectively it never got dark. The sun stayed up pretty much all the time. And when you arrive, one of the things that they immediately warn you about living in Antarctica there, where the sun's not going down, is to not get involved in what's called free cycling, where your body sort of gets into a pattern where you don't have a regular sleep pattern. It can get, you end up compromising your immune system. And scientists sometimes get very excited about what they're doing. And, they go in the lab and 42 hours later, they realize they haven't gone to bed. And so that can be a challenge. And you have to force yourself to, go to your regular meals, go to the gym, work out, do the kinds of things that establishes the circadian rhythm that you need.
Mm-hmm.
At Palmer Station, it does get dark. Not a lot, but there is definitely a nighttime. And so that's not quite as much of an issue adjusting to the photo period, if you will, at Palmer Station. And then, of course, you have to adjust to the fact that you're living in a fairly isolated situation.
Mm-hmm. What is the size of the continent?
Oh, the continent is huge. People don't realize it's the size of China and India combined, if you can imagine. So it really is a massive continent,
mm-hmm.
Surrounded by the Southern Ocean, which is a fundamental difference with the Arctic, which is an ocean surrounded by continents. So Antarctica really is unique in that sense.
Mm-hmm. And then once you're there, what's the type of work that you're doing? What are you studying and learning while you're there?
Yeah, this has varied over the years. The primary theme of our research, my colleagues and I, has been a field known as marine chemical ecology. So we're interested in studying how marine invertebrates, things like sponges and soft corals and tunicates and things that are generally immobile, things that don't typically have a shell, a protective shell, live on, and also I should mention seaweeds as well. These organisms are vulnerable to predators. They can't run away. They can't hide inside some sort of protective covering. So what has happened over evolutionary time is that these organisms have often evolved chemicals that are toxic. They don't taste good. They might prevent other organisms from growing over their surfaces. So there is this entire field of trying to understand how chemistry plays a role in the ecology of these ecosystems. And we sort of established ourselves, my colleagues, Chuck Amsler and Bill Baker and I, as the chemical ecology group working in Antarctica. And then it's kind of a neat area because it combines aspects of basic research and applied research. Because one of our colleagues, Bill Baker, is a chemist that is also very much involved in drug discovery. So the chemicals that we work with or we discover in these Antarctic sponges and corals and things, if they're bioactive, meaning that they actually have a role in defending the organism, they may also have activity against cancer or AIDS or cystic fibrosis or bacterial infections. And it's really neat to have that combination of doing basic ecology and also knowing that we might be able to sort of crack a puzzle and help eradicate a disease or help fight a disease. And we've had a couple of pretty exciting discoveries in that realm over the years.
Amazing. What about some of the studies around how the climate is changing or what you're noticing?
This has evolved from my moving to Palmer Station. And our group got interested in living in a place that was so fundamentally dynamic. And 20 years ago when we arrived at Palmer Station, there had been a long ongoing study of a population of penguins, Adelie penguins, on these small islands in front of the station. And Bill Fraser, who's the principal investigator on that project, he essentially had been following these penguins for 45 years, and they had been disappearing quite dramatically. And it piqued my interest in what's happening. And I began to poke around in the literature and find that the air temperatures were warming very rapidly on the peninsula. The sea temperature was increasing. The glacier, you would not believe this, Rob. When I first went down to Palmer Station 20 years ago, the Mar Glacier, this huge glacier behind our station, it would drop a chunk of ice into the bay behind the station, once or twice a week. It was a big deal. People would leap up and run down the hall and crowd around the door and peek out into the bay and watch the big waves. And when I was down there in this past February and March, you could hear the glacier calving many times a day sometimes. And this is representative of what's happening all up and down the western side of the 800-mile length of the peninsula. We're seeing close to 90% of the glaciers are in recession. So this really got me piqued and interested in how climate change might rewrite the ecosystems along this area. And the area that we've been studying primarily is the effects of warming, the sea warming on marine invertebrates and seaweeds, and also an area that's related that we call ocean acidification. And this is related to climate change in the sense that when we burn fossil fuels, about 30% of the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the air is absorbed by the world's oceans. And this is a problem because the pH, the acidity of seawater, since the Industrial Revolution has increased about 30%. And it turns out that the colder the ocean is, the more CO2 is absorbed. So guess where the coldest ocean in the world is? It's surrounding Antarctica. So the amount of CO2 in the Antarctic Southern Ocean is a little higher than it is in other places, meaning that the acidification of the water is a little more pronounced. So this makes Antarctica sort of the canary in the coal mine for looking at ocean acidification. So what we do is we actually set up tanks in the laboratory. We call them mesocosms. And we simulate the future in the laboratory by bubbling carbon dioxide into the seawater at different rates. And we have controls. And so we can measure the responses of these marine invertebrates and seaweeds to the future as related to warming and as related to ocean acidification. And we find there are some losers and there are some that do fine. It seems to be varies from species to species. But in the big picture, marine biologists are very concerned about the long-term impacts of ocean acidification on marine life, particularly organisms that make skeletons, have to be able to calcify. That's difficult to do under conditions of acidity.
So, by the way, on the cover of your book, Bill Gates had an endorsement, which was really nice to see that. And I want to ask you about that in a second. But while I was doing some of my research, I happened upon a recent video that Bloomberg did in an interview with Bill Gates. And of course, most of it was speaking about the pandemic. But at a certain point, they started to talk about climate change. And Bill Gates made a comment where he said that the effect on the world from climate change will be much greater than what's happening at this moment with the pandemic. So if you think this is something, climate change, while maybe down the line and not maybe so abrupt, will have such an impact. What are some of the things that you see into the future? Should we keep moving the way we're moving?
Certainly under the business as usual scenario, the impacts will be quite significant. And I really think we're already beginning to see them. And one of the encouraging things to me is it's getting more and more difficult to not appreciate that already we're seeing these impacts. Here in Alabama, where I live, this is manifested in more days that are extreme heat during the year. It's manifest in rainfall. No longer do we get these gentle rains. We tend to get more of a torrential rainfall. This is something that's predicted under climate change scenarios. And this is a problem for us here because what this does is it essentially floods the rivers, the banks are eroded. There's a lot of damage that can occur when you have these flooding situations. Hurricanes are certainly maybe not more abundant in terms of numbers, but climate scientists believe that the intensity of hurricanes has been growing under climate change. So that if you have this super warmed water in the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic, that as these storms come across from Africa, when they hit that warm water, they jump from a category 2 to a 3, or a 3 to a 4. I think last year we saw, what was it, 3 5s lined up. I mean, it was quite remarkable. So these things are already beginning to happen. And I really think it's important that we take a very serious look at this and get back to work. We need to work as a country to try to mitigate CO2 production. I'm encouraged. There are some things that are happening that are positive, particularly at the, if not the, some aspects of government, the corporate level is, corporate component is stepping up in many cases. I never thought that Walmart would insist on a solar field before it built its next store in Alabama. But,
and you're seeing that now?
Yeah, we're seeing some of that even here in the South, where renewable energy is still not quite as aggressively pursued as other parts of the country. We do have some very large solar fields going in. Near the capital of Alabama in Montgomery. Private companies building them. Tellingly, it's a subsidiary of British Petroleum. It's building the solar. So you're even seeing oil companies begin to diversify a little bit into renewable energy. But when I spent the day with Bill Gates at Palmer Station, he was very interested in climate change. He wanted to hear, from me about what was happening in Antarctica and what I thought the future held. And he seemed to have a sincere interest in doing something about it.
When the world started to go into quarantine, there were many pictures from around the world of how clear the skies were.
Oh, yes.
And I was curious about, sort of what that means in the grand scheme of things, or was it just a point in time and just, because things reopened, it didn't really make a difference to the future so much?
Yeah, I think it was more figurative than formative in a sense.
I see.
Yeah, I was really impressed with those images that were, I think it was in the New York Times, I'm not sure. But they had the major cities around the world showing, before and after COVID. And some cities, apparently mountain ranges appeared that people didn't even realize were behind the city. I found that very powerful, though. I thought, this is the kind of world that we could be living in if we put our resources into building renewable energy to replace burning fossil fuels. And I think there was some inherent value in humanity's exposure to that possibility, and that it happened so quickly, and I think that's very striking. But in the long run, scientists are predicting that that's not going to have a huge mitigation impact itself.
Could we get our skies to look like that on a regular basis?
Oh, absolutely.
What would we need to do?
Well, we'd need to really ramp up the renewable energy sector. We're talking about solar, we're talking about wind generators, maybe nuclear as being a component. But yeah, if we can get away from burning fossil fuels, we could have a huge impact on the clarity of the air. And it's also not just an issue of the CO2 warming our planet, but our health, because we're talking about air pollution. And there's a measurable number of respiratory deaths that occur every year under those air pollution scenarios. So I think that there's many benefits to doing that. Can it be done overnight? No, but it can be done. I really believe it. I think, and the argument that there's no jobs in the renewable energy sector and we're going to have this terrible scenario in our economy if we stop burning fossil fuels, I don't really buy that personally. I really believe that the future is going to be in renewable energy and that there are a lot of opportunities to build jobs into that.
Some of the solutions you mentioned are people understand them, but one that maybe they hear sometimes that's kind of scary is when somebody says nuclear.
Right.
And can you explain how nuclear is actually a safe energy and can be produced inexpensively and be quite useful?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on nuclear energy by any means, but I do feel that there's some obvious things that you don't build a nuclear power plant on the coast, right along the ocean front. You don't put them on a fault line for earthquakes, and so I think you can do things to mitigate the potential of dangerous outcomes with nuclear. There's always been the pressing issue of what to do with nuclear waste and how to store it safely. But in my readings about climate change and from what I know, to really put together a non-fossil fuel future, I think nuclear is going to have to play some part of that, is what I understand.
Mm-hmm. Back to Antarctica for a second. What was it like when you learned you would have a spot on the coast of Antarctica that would be named McClintock Point in your honor by the U.S. Board of Geographic Names?
It was very wonderful feeling. So this was an area across McMurdo Sound from the station where we had the group that I worked with had spent some time doing research. And a colleague of mine, Bill Baker, was also named for a point. So Bill and I will sort of face each other from point to point for eternity. But it was very, it just gave me chills and a great sense of gratitude that somebody would do that. And this is an unusual thing that in Antarctica there are naming opportunities, geographic naming opportunities. And I have really enjoyed nominating others for this honor over the last 20 or so years. And let's see, there's one, two. I've been fortunate to write letters of recommendation for namings for 3 colleagues in Antarctica that were all successful. It includes two islands, and a small mountain at the base of a fjord. So it's fun to be able to really give back to people who've dedicated their time to promoting science in Antarctica.
For a common person, what are some simple lifestyle tweaks that one can make to help address climate change? What can one person do on a daily basis?
Well, I get asked that question a lot, and I think the most perfunctory, probably the most important thing you can do is to vote. Put your voice out there. A lot of people don't realize how, writing a letter to a senator or a congressman or an email or making that personal touch can really make a difference. Certainly that's something you want to take advantage of, is voting. And vote for those candidates that you feel are supportive of environmental issues, such as climate change. Other things that you can do, there's things like how you set the thermostat in your house, saving energy in that regard, recycling, your choice of travel? Are you riding a bike to work? Are you driving a car? If you're driving a car, what type of car are you driving? I broke down and bought a Prius about 5 years ago, and I thought, well, I'm going to do this because this is my world, and I'm going to live what I'm talking about. And it turns out in Alabama right now, probably a Prius, a hybrid, is a better choice than an electric car, surprisingly, because our electricity comes largely from burning fossil fuel here right now. There's not a lot of renewable energy that's going into that electricity. So anyway, I have gotten spoiled. I love my Prius. I really do. It's a zippy little car, gets me around, and 52 miles to the gallon, and I forget to go to the gas station. It's the visits are so infrequent, and then I put $17 of gas in it to fill it up. It's just remarkable. I'm saving a tremendous amount of money by driving this Prius, and glad because it's contributing less to CO2 production. So your mode of transportation, you're insulating your house, doing things like you can get these smart thermostats. There are any number of joining nonprofits and working for nonprofits, helping support them that are working in areas of environmental stewardship, sustainability. All of these things add up. And I really do believe that collectively it makes a difference.
In 2018, you joined the Nature Conservatory as a spokesman for a campaign called Can We Talk Climate? Can you explain that campaign and why it's relevant?
Yeah, the Nature Conservancy established this Can We Talk Climate campaign because they felt that one thing in the United States that we don't do enough of is just talk about climate change. We need to get it out there more. And so they established this program. It's a pledge. And it's a pledge that you make that doesn't involve any pledge of money. You go to the Nature Conservancy's website and Can We Talk Climate, and you essentially pledge that within 1 week from the time that you hit the button, you will talk to one person about climate change. It could be a colleague at work. It could be your uncle who may not believe in global warming. It could be your mother, but somebody. And the nice thing about it is the website is populated with lots of good information about how to talk about climate change and how important it is when you talk about climate change that you essentially find common ground. You don't sort of become a scientist and speak down to somebody with all the facts and tell them that if they don't buy that Prius, they're obviously not going to be good people. But rather you might bring up the fact that your neighbor's tomato garden has been blooming earlier than it used to. And when they notice that these things are happening around them that are tied to climate change, and they begin to make that connection, it can be a very forceful, powerful tool to get them to think about the realities of climate change. I can remember I give a lot of talks for Rotary clubs and things like this, and I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, I really do believe that this is happening, and the reason I'm really thinking it's happening is because I can't get insurance on my beach house like I used to. The insurance companies in some cases are pulling out of insuring coastal homes, or it's gotten extremely expensive. And this is probably related to the increased danger of sea level rise. And they're making those connections. And that's a great jumping off point to say, well, if you can't get insurance for your beach house, it probably is related to climate change. And this is why climate change is happening. And these are some of the things we might do to address it.
Mm.
So that was the gist of the campaign, the Nature Conservancy.
Yeah, I really like that, and I was interested when I read it says that on the information that Americans rarely discuss this issue with family or friends, so it must be an uncomfortable discussion. I know after speaking with you, I was excited to talk to some people about it. And I always think, when you're having a conversation like this, it's great to listen and hear
Mhm.
how people see things and what their views are. And it doesn't need to be contentious. It could be
Right.
very respectful. And one of the wonderful things we can do in this world is listen to each other. I'm curious how you define interconnectedness with the environment and how we're doing with that as a society.
Well, I think as a marine ecologist, I'm always sort of thinking about how different components of systems are interconnected. So I've got that perspective. When I put it in the context of climate change, which is the focus of much of my thought about these things, I'm seeing an improvement in people making these interconnections between the root causes of climate, the sources of greenhouse gases, the impacts that they're having on our daily lives as weather patterns are becoming more dramatic and intense. So if you use that as a microcosm of how society is beginning to appreciate these interconnections between the burning of fossil fuel and the impacts on our environment, I think we're moving in the right direction. There is a component of denialism there that I don't know how deeply they're thinking about those interconnections, but at large, I see this in the students that I teach at the university too. There seems to be a growing appreciation for how things are interconnected. I think COVID has also impacted people in that sense. And they're realizing that there are these interconnections between the stresses that we place on our planet and the impacts it has on our own health, humanity's health.
Yeah. When we spoke prior to our recording, I asked you about Antarctica, and I said, is it, in some ways a spiritual place? Or, I kind of use this example of this documentary from National Geographic called One Strange Rock, where the astronauts look down on the Earth and they start to sort of see things in a much different way. And I'm wondering if you could, just as we close here, share a little bit about your thoughts on what it's been like to visit that continent so often in your lifetime.
Antarctica is the most amazing place you will ever visit in your life. Antarctica will change you for the rest of your life. I'm really convinced of that. It is almost impossible to visit Antarctica and not return an ambassador to Antarctica. Often I'll see individuals that will get to Antarctica the first time and spend a lot of time figuring out how to get back. So why is all this? I think it's a combination of factors. There is sort of a spiritual element to visiting Antarctica. It's otherworldly. You really feel like you're on another planet. And part of what contributes to that is the vastness of the landscapes. You're looking across space and thinking that you can touch a mountain range with your fingers and realizing it's 100 miles away. The air is rarefied. It's just beautiful. The mountains are just stunning. The ocean is teeming with life. So you're watching penguins porpoise through the water along the sides of the ship. There could be a group of humpbacks that you stop to watch bubble feed, taking big breaths of air and dropping into the water and blowing concentric bubble sort of gatherings that bring the krill together in this cylinder of bubbles, and then watching the humpbacks come swimming up through the krill and coming out of the water, and they're bailing, straining out the thousands of krill. And so the abundance of wildlife, the vastness of the scale of the landscape, the remoteness, the fact that you're down there typically and you don't see other ships, you're sort of isolated there. It all conspires to be the most otherworldly place on the planet that you can go to and come away from and probably rejuvenated, excited. It builds a sense of wanting to take care of Antarctica and realizing the fragility of this place and its role in teaching us about taking care of the planet as a whole.
Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today and to bring this conversation of leading with genuine care to the forefront. And to all the loyal listeners, I greatly appreciate you spending time with us today, and I wish you all much love and gratitude.